On November 9, 1955, in a small ceremony in Santa Barbara, Rock Hudson married a woman named Phyllis Gates. There were 5 people in the room. The bride wore a simple suit. The groom was the biggest movie star in America, fresh off the set of Giant, and by every measure, the most desirable man in Hollywood. His agent, Henry Willson, stood there watching, and the moment the ceremony ended, before the couple had cut a cake or posed for a photograph, Willson walked to a telephone and called Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons, the 2 most powerful gossip columnists in the country. He gave them the scoop personally. Rock Hudson, Hollywood's most eligible bachelor, was officially off the market. It was the single most important phone call of Wilson's career, and it had nothing to do with romance. 3 weeks earlier, Confidential magazine had been preparing to publish a story that would have ended Rock Hudson overnight. The story was about his lovers, his male lovers, first-person accounts, names, details, the kind of piece that, in 1955, wouldn't just damage a career, it would erase one. A man accused of homosexuality in Eisenhower's America didn't get a second act. He got a closed door. Willson killed the story. He did it by feeding Confidential 2 of his other clients instead, lesser names whose careers he considered expendable, and handing the magazine enough dirt on them to fill the pages that had been reserved for Hudson. He traded 2 men's lives to protect one. And then, to make sure the protection held, he arranged a wedding. Phyllis Gates was Wilson's own secretary. She was 26, from a farm in Minnesota, a former Sunday school teacher. She had been dating Hudson for a few months, and later insisted, for the rest of her life, that she married him because she loved him. He was charming. His career was red-hot. He was gorgeous, she told People magazine years later. How many women would have said no? She said she didn't know. She said she had no idea the man she was marrying had never been attracted to a woman in his life, that the courtship had been staged, that the wedding was a press release dressed up as a sacrament. Whether that's true is one of the questions this story keeps circling back to. Because she worked in Wilson's office, she answered his phone, she handled his mail, and Henry Wilson's business was knowing exactly which of his clients were gay and managing that information for profit. She was in the room where the secrets lived, and she said she never heard a thing. The marriage lasted 3 years. It produced no children, almost no affection, and one secretly recorded confession that wouldn't surface for decades. And the man at the center of it, the tall, square-jawed leading man who'd been manufactured from a shy kid named Roy Fitzgerald, spent another 27 years after the divorce keeping the same secret, until the disease that killed him made keeping it impossible. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The man the world knew as Rock Hudson was invented twice. Once by an agent who saw a face and decided to build a product around it, and once, much earlier, by a boy who figured out that pretending to be someone else was the only safe way to survive his own house. He was born Roy Harold Scherer Jr. on November 17, 1925, in Winnetka, Illinois, a suburb north of Chicago that sounds comfortable and mostly was, unless you lived in the wrong part of it. His mother, Catherine, was a telephone operator. His father, Roy Sr., was an auto mechanic. When the Depression hit and the work dried up, his father did what a certain kind of man does when things get hard. He left. Roy was about 8. His father walked out, and the boy didn't see much of him after that. Catherine divorced Roy Sr. and, a few years later, married a man named Wallace Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald adopted the boy and gave him his name, so Roy Scherer became Roy Fitzgerald. That's the only generous thing Fitzgerald appears to have done for him. The stepfather was a drinker and a bully. He confiscated Roy's toys, told the boy he was trying to make a man out of him, and beat him when the results didn't satisfy. Roy remembered it plainly as an adult. "He took all my toys away and used to beat me regularly," he said in one interview. When Roy told his stepfather he wanted acting lessons, the response was a slap. That was the end of the conversation. In Fitzgerald's house, Wanting to act was soft, suspicious, something a real boy wouldn't ask for. Roy learned to stop asking, so he went quiet. At New Trier High School, the same school that produced Charlton Heston and Anne Margaret, Roy Fitzgerald was nobody in particular. He sang in the glee club. He delivered newspapers, ran errands, caddied at the local golf course. He tried out for school plays and couldn't land a part because he had trouble memorizing lines, a problem that would follow him for years. His grades were bad enough that he had to stay an extra semester before graduating in early 1944. Nothing about him, on paper, predicted anything. What he had was a face. He was tall, dark-haired, square-jawed, and growing into the kind of looks that would later make him the most bankable romantic lead in Hollywood. He didn't know what to do with that yet. He just knew he wanted to be in movies. He'd known since he was small, watching John Hall dive off cliffs in the hurricane, deciding right then that he had to get to a place where people did things like that for a living. But Winnetka wasn't that place, and Wallace Fitzgerald's house certainly wasn't. And Roy had no money, no connections, no training, and no plan. 3 weeks after graduating, he enlisted in the Navy. It was January 1944. He trained at Great Lakes Naval Training Center outside Chicago, then shipped out to the Philippines on a troop transport called the Lew Wallace. He spent 2 years on the island of Samar, fixing airplanes. It wasn't glamorous. By some accounts, he was eventually transferred off airplane repair and into the laundry unit. The future leading man of Giant spent part of his military service washing other sailors' clothes. He came home in May of 1946, discharged in California, and made a decision that would have seemed delusional to anyone who knew him. He was going to stay in Los Angeles and become an actor. He had no training, no contacts in the industry, and no education to fall back on. He applied to the University of Southern California's drama program and was rejected because of his grades. That door closed fast. What followed was a string of jobs that sound like the setup to a joke about aspiring actors. He moved pianos. He sold vacuum cleaners door to door for his biological father, who had resurfaced in Long Beach with a new wife and a small appliances business. Roy was so shy he didn't make a single sale in his first month, and his own father fired him. He drove a truck for a company owned by a friend of his father's. He was 21, living in Los Angeles, hauling freight, and still telling anyone who'd listen that he was going to be in the movies. One night in 1947, in a bar on Ocean Boulevard in Long Beach, he met a man named Ken Hodge, a former radio producer who took an interest in him. Hodge bought him a gym membership to build up his frame, got him some headshots, and started introducing him around. Through Hodge, or through the photos Hodge circulated, Roy Fitzgerald's face ended up in front of the one person in Hollywood who would know exactly what to do with it. Henry Willson was a talent agent at a company called Valet International, and later at Famous Artists. He had a type and he had a system. His type was tall, good-looking young men, preferably without much experience, who needed someone to shape their careers. His system was simple and, by any honest accounting, predatory. He signed them, renamed them, groomed them for the screen, and in many cases slept with them, blurring the line between professional management and sexual coercion in a way that the industry tolerated because it preferred not to look. Willson saw Roy Fitzgerald's photos and liked what he saw. He agreed to take a meeting. What happened next would turn a tongue-tied truck driver from Illinois into the biggest movie star in America, give him a name he said he hated for the rest of his life, and begin a 30-year performance that had nothing to do with any script. Roy Fitzgerald was about to become Rock Hudson. He was also about to learn the price of the ticket. Henry Willson had a system, and the system had a name, though nobody called it that out loud. Biographer Robert Hoffler, who spent years reconstructing Wilson's career, called it the Adonis Factory. The raw material was young men, preferably tall, preferably good-looking, preferably from nowhere in particular, with no money and no connections and no realistic path to the thing they wanted most. Willson would find them, sign them, reshape them top to bottom, and send them out as finished products. The process included dental work, Acting lessons, singing lessons, fencing lessons, horseback riding, posed photographs for the fan magazines, and a new name, always a new name. The names were part of the brand. Willson had a theory that his clients needed monikers that sounded hard and masculine, 2 syllables, punchy, the kind of name you could put on a marquee and have it mean something to a woman in Iowa who'd never left her county. Francis McCown became Rory Calhoun, Arthur Gellion became Tab Hunter, Merle Johnson became Troy Donahue, Orison Hungerford, which sounds like a Victorian novel, became Ty Hardin, and Roy Fitzgerald, the shy truck driver from Winnetka who couldn't sell vacuum cleaners and had washed laundry in the Philippines, became Rock Hudson. Willson chose Rock after the Rock of Gibraltar. He chose Hudson after the Hudson River. He later said he wanted something solid, immovable, American. Roy Fitzgerald heard the name for the first time and said he hated it. He kept saying that for the rest of his career. He told interviewers it sounded ridiculous, that it wasn't him, that he'd always thought of himself as Roy. He kept the name anyway, because Willson had the contract and the connections, and Roy Fitzgerald had $38 and a truck. The deal Willson offered his clients was real advancement wrapped in real exploitation. He'd get them screen tests, get their teeth fixed, get them in front of studio executives, and in exchange he expected sexual availability from many of them, particularly the gay ones. Tab Hunter described the dynamic in his memoir, calling it Willson's routine, wine and dine you, come on to you, and then claim he was joking if you hesitated. Ryan Murphy, who later dramatized Willson's life for Netflix, put it more directly. He said Willson would find young men from terrible home situations, take them on as clients, and make them sexually service him. He called Willson a tormented gay man who preyed on tormented gay men. That was the engine underneath all the manufactured stardom. Rock Hudson went along with whatever the arrangement required, because the alternative was driving a truck for the rest of his life, and he knew it. He was gay, had known it since he was a teenager in Winnetka sneaking money to buy cinema tickets instead of spending it on what his stepfather wanted. And Hollywood in 1947 was, for a gay man, a place of extraordinary danger, dressed up as opportunity. The vice squads were real. The anti-sodomy laws were real. A single arrest, a single story in the wrong column, and a career was finished before it began. Willson understood this terrain better than anyone because he lived in it himself, and he used that understanding both to protect his clients and to control them. The knowledge was a leash. The debut did not inspire confidence. In 1948, Willson got Rock a small part in a Warner Brothers film called Fighter Squadron. Rock had one line in the whole picture. He couldn't get it out. The line was, "You'd better get a bigger blackboard," and it took him 38 takes before the director had something usable. 38 attempts at 8 words. The crew waited. The director's patience bent without breaking. Rock walked off the set that day, knowing the story would follow him, and it did, because in Hollywood, a 38-take single line is the kind of thing people mention at dinner parties for decades. Willson got him into Universal anyway. Universal put him through the full factory treatment: acting coaching, singing, dancing, fencing, and horseback riding, plus regular appearances in the fan magazines, which were the algorithm of the 1950s. The studio learned early that whatever else Rock Hudson was or wasn't, he photographed beautifully. The camera did something to his face that no amount of coaching could teach, so they put the face in front of readers, built familiarity, and started feeding him parts while the coaching caught up. The parts were small for a long time. He played an American Indian in Winchester, 73, an Arab in The Desert Hawk, a string of westerns and adventure pictures where the requirement was mostly to look good on a horse and not ruin the scene. He did 28 films in 6 years at Universal, most of them forgettable, climbing the billing slowly, learning in public because there was no other option. By 1952, he was getting lead roles in pictures like Scarlet Angel, still not important films, but his name at the top of the poster. Then came 1954, and a director named Douglas Sirk, and a melodrama called Magnificent Obsession. Sirk cast Rock opposite Jane Wyman in a story about a reckless playboy who accidentally blinds a widow and spends years making amends. It was the kind of outsized emotional material that Rock had never been given before, and something happened when he got into it. The audience responded to him in a way they hadn't in the westerns. The film made money, a lot of it, and the studio and the fan magazines took notice. Life magazine ran a cover story on him in September 1955 under the headline, "Hollywood's Most Handsome Bachelor." The copy noted, with a pointed delicacy typical of the era, that fans were urging the 29-year-old Hudson to get married, or explain why not. Then came Giant, with James Dean and Elizabeth Taylor. Then came an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor. Then came the moment when Rock Hudson stopped being a product Willson was pushing and became the biggest male star in Hollywood. Which is exactly when the problem Willson had been managing for years got too big to manage with photographs alone. The magazine with the names and the details was almost ready to print, and Henry Willson was going to need something bigger than a new name to make it go away. Confidential magazine was the most feared publication in Hollywood, and in 1955, it had a $10,000 bounty on Rock Hudson. That number tells you everything about where Hudson stood by the middle of the decade. You don't put a price on a nobody. Confidential paid informants, ex-lovers, hotel staff, anyone who could bring documented proof of a star's private life. And by 1955, the price on Hudson meant the magazine already believed the story existed. They just needed someone to sign their name to it. They had first-person accounts from men who said they'd been with him. They had enough to fill several pages with specifics. When Willson found out the story was coming, he didn't panic visibly. He went to work. He had done this before, trading smaller scandals to kill larger ones, feeding the machine just enough to keep it from swallowing his most valuable client. This time, the stakes were higher than anything he'd previously managed, and the solution he arrived at was ugly enough that even by Hollywood standards, people talked about it for decades afterward. He made a deal with Confidential's editors. In exchange for killing the Hudson story, he would hand them two others. The first was Rory Calhoun. Calhoun was one of Wilson's own clients, a man Willson himself had renamed, groomed, and built from nothing, the same process he'd used on Hudson. Calhoun had a past he'd kept buried, a string of juvenile crimes, burglaries and car thefts, time in a reform school and later in prison, before he got out and found his way to Hollywood. Willson handed all of it to Confidential, in detail. The magazine ran the story. Calhoun's criminal history spread across their pages, sourced by the man who was supposed to be protecting him. The second was Tab Hunter. Hunter had been another Willson client, but he'd fired Willson in 1955 and signed with a rival agent, which Willson took as a personal betrayal he never got over. Hunter had been arrested in 1950 at a private gay party in Glendale, a fact that had stayed buried for 5 years. Willson handed that to Confidential too, 3 months after Hunter walked, with the timing precise enough that nobody in Hollywood misread the message. 2 men's private lives, handed to the most vicious magazine in the country by their own former agent, in exchange for one man's secret staying secret. Rory Calhoun, ironically, survived it. The bad boy criminal history actually sharpened his image rather than destroying it. Tab Hunter's was more damaging, though his career staggered forward regardless. Willson had calculated correctly that neither story would cause as much damage as the Hudson one would have. He was probably right. A gay leading man in 1955, Eisenhower, America wasn't a scandal. It was an ending. But killing the magazine story bought time, not permanent safety. Hollywood still talked. The fan magazines were still asking why the most handsome bachelor in the movies wasn't married. Life magazine that September put Hudson on the cover and noted, with the era's particular brand of pointed delicacy, that fans were urging the 29-year-old to get married, or explain why not. The cover line was practically a deadline. Wilson's answer was Phyllis Gates. She was his own secretary, 26 years old, from a farm in Dawson, Minnesota, a former Sunday school teacher. She'd been dating Hudson casually for a few months, and by most accounts believed the relationship was genuine. Willson moved fast. Within days of the life peace, the marriage was arranged, and on November 9th, 1955, 5 weeks after Giant wrapped, Rock Hudson and Phyllis Gates were married in a small ceremony in Santa Barbara, with Willson and 3 friends present. The moment the ceremony ended, before the couple left the room, Willson walked to a telephone and called Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons. 2 of the most powerful gossip columnists in the country fed the story personally, directly, before any reporter had a chance to find it themselves. The marriage announcement went out on Wilson's terms, framed exactly the way he wanted it framed. It was the most efficient press release ever disguised as a wedding. And somewhere in that small room in Santa Barbara, a 26-year-old woman from Minnesota who said she was in love stood next to a man who, whatever else he felt for her, had married her because his agent needed the story killed before Monday. The honeymoon was barely underway when Rock Hudson said something that should have been a warning. They were in Jamaica, 3 days married, sitting at dinner on their first night at the Half Moon Hotel in Montego Bay. Phyllis was still catching up to the fact that she, Phyllis Gates of Dawson, Minnesota, was now Mrs. Rock Hudson. Then her new husband raised his glass and proposed a toast. "We must always stick together," he told her, "and not let anyone try to pull us apart. Hollywood is full of vicious people who spread stories and rumors. Never believe any of them." Years later, on Larry King's show, Phyllis repeated that toast word for word from memory. King listened, then said quietly, "You know the reason he was saying that." She paused. "I didn't know then," she said. She said that a lot over the years. She didn't know. She had no idea. The man she married had not been honest with her, and she had been deceived. She said it in her 1987 memoir, in interviews, on television, until the day she died in 2006. And the question of whether she's telling the truth is one that everyone who has studied this story lands on eventually, because the answer changes what the marriage actually was. Here is what is not in dispute. Phyllis worked as Henry Willson's secretary starting in 1954. Willson was gay, openly so within his own world, and his entire professional operation was built around managing the sexual secrets of his clients, many of whom were also gay. Rock Hudson came into that office regularly. The people in that office knew what Rock Hudson was. Mark Griffin, who wrote the most thorough biography of Hudson, said it plainly. Virtually every bit player, makeup man, and assistant gopher at Universal knew the score about Rock Hudson. The idea that his agent's own secretary somehow missed it strains belief in a way that is hard to argue around. What is also documented is that some of Hudson's friends believed Phyllis was herself a lesbian, a woman who understood exactly what she was walking into and saw advantages in the arrangement. A gay man needed a wife. A lesbian woman who wanted financial security and a place in Hollywood society needed a respectable marriage. On that reading, the whole thing was a transaction, entered into by 2 people who both understood the terms, and neither of whom said so out loud. Phyllis denied it until the end. So the truth of what she knew sits somewhere in the gap between her account and everyone else's, and it has never been fully closed. What is certain is how the marriage actually felt from the inside, because she described it in detail. After Jamaica, after the toast and the coconuts, and the photographs of the smiling newlyweds boarding the Pan American Clipper in Miami, they came home to Rock's house on Warbler Place, a California cottage above the Sunset Strip in what was known as the Bird Streets, and the marriage began to dissolve almost immediately. She described him as moody, given to sudden depressions and childish tantrums with no warning and no apparent cause. The sex life was, in her careful phrasing, not entirely satisfactory. He went long stretches without being present in any real sense, even when he was physically in the same room. He would be warm and charming on some days and then simply absent the next, not gone but closed off, unreachable, as though the version of himself that had courted her was a character he could only sustain for so long before he had to put it down. Then came Italy. In 1957, Hudson went to Rome to film A Farewell to Arms, the Hemingway adaptation, and while he was there, the rumors started. A friend of Phyllis's, someone close enough to speak to her directly, confirmed that Rock had been unfaithful on location, and then told her the rest of it. The person Rock had been with was a man. Phyllis said that was the moment she understood. That was when the moodiness and the distance and the not entirely satisfactory sex and the Jamaica toast all arranged themselves into a shape she could finally read. She filed for a legal separation in 1957 and began divorce proceedings. And then she did something that nobody outside a small circle of Hollywood insiders knew about for decades. She hired Fred Otash. Otash was a former lapped officer who had become the most notorious private detective in Los Angeles, the man you called when you needed something found or buried, a fixer who worked for Confidential magazine as a fact-checker, and for anyone else who could pay his rates. Phyllis's new attorney, Arthur Crowley, brought Otash in with a specific task: get evidence of Hudson's homosexuality on tape, something that could be used in settlement negotiations if Rock tried to leave her with nothing. Rock had already shown his hand on that front. When the divorce discussions began, his initial offer was, in the words of one account, a few measly dollars, her car, and no place to live. The biggest movie star in America, worth a fortune, offering his wife of 3 years a car and pocket change. Otash bugged the house on Warbler Place. And in January 1958, a few months before the divorce was finalized, Phyllis sat down with Rock and had a confrontation. She had the recorder running. Rock Hudson, on tape, in his own voice, confirmed what she was asking him about. The confession was recorded, transcribed, and handed to Crowley. When Rock's lawyers saw the transcript, the settlement offer changed. Phyllis walked away with the house on Warbler Place, $250 a week for 10 years, provided she didn't remarry, and stock in Rock's production company. In today's money, the weekly payments alone add up to over $1 million. The tape bought her a life. The divorce was finalized on August 13, 1958. The grounds were mental cruelty. Rock did not contest it. Phyllis eventually rebuilt her life as an interior decorator and never remarried. She kept the tape, kept quiet, and kept saying until the very end that she had loved him and had not known. The tape still exists. What exactly Rock said on it has never been fully published. The transcript is in the Otash archives. And the question of what Phyllis Gates actually knew, and when, went with her to her grave in 2006. Rock Hudson walked out of that marriage and straight back into the double life that had made it necessary. He was 32 years old, the most famous leading man in Hollywood, and the secret was still intact. For now. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. By 1959, Rock Hudson was the biggest male star in Hollywood. And the biggest male star in Hollywood was about to spend 3 films pretending to chase Doris Day. Universal pushed him into pillow talk reluctantly. He didn't want to do romantic comedy, didn't think it suited him, and then it became one of the highest-grossing films of the year. He and Day followed it with Lover Come Back in 1961 and Send Me No Flowers in 1964. 3 films, same formula, same chemistry, enormous box office every time. America bought tickets by the millions to watch Rock Hudson pursue a woman. The irony runs so deep in Pillow Talk that it loops back around to something almost like a joke that only Rock could hear. His character, Brad Allen, runs a scheme to seduce Doris Day's character by pretending to be a shy, unassuming man who is quietly suspected of being gay. A gay man playing a straight man playing a gay man as a romantic ruse. Biographer Mark Griffin described it as a house of mirrors. The character performs homosexuality as a disguise, while the actor performs heterosexuality as a career. Every layer of that construction was built from Rock Hudson's actual life, and nobody in the audience had any idea. Off the Doris Day set and away from Universal's publicity machine, Rock was living a different life entirely, one that the people immediately around him knew about, and the rest of the world didn't. His sexuality was, as one documentary filmmaker later put it, an open secret within Hollywood. known to colleagues, protected by allies, never said out loud in print. Elizabeth Taylor knew, Doris Day knew, and later said it made no difference to her whatsoever. Directors and crew members knew. The knowing was one of those facts that everyone held quietly, like a shared agreement to keep the weather from changing. What they were protecting was a man who, away from the cameras, was building a real life within the constraints available to him. After the divorce from Phyllis, Rock had a series of relationships, some brief and some lasting. In 1962, he met a man named Lee Garlington, a young Hollywood extra-turned stockbroker, who later described their 3-year romance with a clarity that cuts through all the mythology. Garlington said he'd heard the rumors about Rock and had deliberately positioned himself outside Rock's cottage on the Universal lot one day, pretending to read Variety, probably upside down, waiting for Hudson to walk past. Hudson walked out, looked back once, and that was the beginning of it. They were together from 1962 to 1965. Rock was the biggest movie star in the world, and their relationship existed in a shadow. No photographs together. Rock's agent had made that rule explicit. The only pictures Garlington kept were ones they took of each other separately, never side by side. He has an antique box in his bedroom closet where he keeps them. In 1963, they rented a house on the beach in Puerto Vallarta, just the two of them, and Garlington later described it as the closest either of them came to an ordinary life. People left him alone there, he said. They didn't even know who he was. We walked on the beach and took pictures of each other. I remember driving around in an open Jeep, just living the life of two normal gay men that loved each other. Rock Hudson in Puerto Vallarta in 1963, driving a Jeep with his boyfriend and not being recognized, was probably the freest he ever felt, and he could only have it for a week because the studio was waiting. Garlington also said something that stays with you. He described Rock as easygoing on the surface, but a bundle of nerves underneath. He chain-smoked. He wore down the skin on his thumb by grinding his fingers against it, a nervous habit so constant it left a concave mark. The man the world watched radiating confidence on screen spent his private hours wearing himself down with anxiety. The performance never stopped requiring something from him. Later came Tom Clark, a publicist who moved into Rock's house in the 1970s. The director Stephen Kijak, who made a documentary about Hudson, described the Clark relationship plainly. They were drinking buddies and sparring partners as much as lovers, volatile together, not an easy fit. What Rock seemed to want, and what eluded him, was the kind of settled, long-term relationship he watched his friends build. He was surrounded by gay men in stable partnerships. He wanted what they had. He couldn't hold it, partly because of the secrecy, and partly because, as Kijak observed, the men he actually fell for tended not to be available to him in the ways that mattered. There was also the ongoing threat of blackmail. The same machinery that had nearly destroyed him through Confidential in 1955 kept running. Partners and acquaintances over the years reportedly tried to leverage what they knew about him. Hudson paid, or Willson arranged for it to go away, or it quietly disappeared. The price of the secret was never paid just once. It was a recurring bill. Meanwhile, the films kept coming. Westerns, thrillers, war pictures, the Doris Day comedies, a television series in the 1970s called Macmillan and Wife that ran for 6 seasons and found him a whole new audience. By the late 1970s, the movie roles had slowed, but Rock Hudson was still famous, still recognizable everywhere, still one of the most beloved figures in American entertainment. And still, in every interview, in every profile, in every fan magazine spread, playing the same character he had been playing since Henry Willson named him after a rock and a river. The all-American leading man, the most desirable straight man in Hollywood. He was 58 years old before any of that changed. And when it changed because his body stopped letting him pretend. It started with a mole. In May of 1984, Rock Hudson attended a state dinner at the White House. He'd known Ronald and Nancy Reagan for decades. They were all part of the same Hollywood generation, and Rock had been a Reagan supporter for years. At some point during the evening, Nancy noticed 2 things about her old friend. He looked too thin, and there was a spot on his neck that didn't look right. A few days later, she sent him a note urging him to have it examined. He did. A dermatologist biopsied the mole, and on June 5, 1984, Rock Hudson sat in a doctor's office and was told what it was. Kaposi's sarcoma, a rare cancer that had, in the previous 3 years, become known for exactly one thing. It was a signature of AIDS. In 1984, an AIDS diagnosis was a death sentence with no appeal. There was no effective treatment in the United States. There was barely research funding. The disease had been killing thousands of people, most of them gay men, for 3 years, while the federal government said almost nothing, and much of the country treated it as something happening to people who didn't matter. And now the most famous leading man of Hollywood's golden age had it. And he understood immediately what the diagnosis meant, twice over. It meant he was dying, and it meant that the secret he had protected for 35 years, the one Henry Willson had traded 2 careers to bury, the one the marriage to Phyllis had been built to hide, would come out with it. You could not, in 1984, announce you had AIDS without the world doing the arithmetic. So he did what he had always done. He told almost no one and went back to work. The circle that knew was tiny. His longtime friends Mark Miller and George Nader, sworn to secrecy. The circle that didn't know included nearly everyone else in his life, and one omission in particular that would later explode into scandal. Mark Christian, the young man who had been Rock's partner since around 1983 and was living in his house, was not told. They went on living together. By Christian's later sworn testimony, they went on being intimate. Rock carried the diagnosis in silence inside his own home, with the person closest to him, for months. He also went looking for a way out. That fall, he flew quietly to Paris, where a doctor named Dominique Dormont at the Pasteur Institute was running experimental treatments with a drug called HPA-23, unavailable in the United States. The early results were startling. After weeks of treatment, tests showed no detectable trace of the virus in his blood. But Dormont warned him bluntly. The virus was suppressed, not gone, and stopping treatment would undo everything. He told Rock how much depended on continuing. Rock said he couldn't. He had a job waiting. He'd signed on for a recurring role on Dynasty, the biggest soap opera on American television, and filming would keep him in Los Angeles for months. He told Dormont he'd come back in February. He didn't return until July, and by then it was too late for the drug to matter. Think about that choice for a moment, because it's the whole man in miniature, offered a treatment that appeared, however temporarily, to be holding back the disease that was killing him. He chose the show, the career, the performance, the public self, the thing he had built his entire life around protecting, took priority over the private body that was failing underneath it. It was the same trade he'd been making since 1948. It's just that this time the price was visible. Dynasty ran him from December 1984 to April 1985, and the show's producers liked his early episodes so much they extended his run. Then came episode 6, and a scene that would become one of the most argued about moments in television history. The script called for his character to kiss Linda Evans. Rock agonized over it for the week before filming. Almost nothing was known then about how AIDS spread. He was terrified, genuinely, privately terrified, that kissing her could infect her, that he'd be delivering what he called a lethal injection with his mouth. But refusing the scene would demand an explanation, and the explanation was the one thing he could not give. So on the day, he protected her, the only way available to him. He used sprays, gargles, and mouthwashes, layer after layer, anything he believed might disinfect him, and then he played the scene, a brief, closed-mouth kiss that the director accepted. Linda Evans didn't learn the truth until years later. When the story eventually broke, the tabloids savaged him for endangering her. What they didn't print was the picture of a dying man standing in his trailer, rinsing his mouth over and over, trying to shield a colleague from a disease he couldn't name out loud. Through 1985, the weight kept falling off him. The rumors got louder, and in July, they became undeniable in the most public way possible. His old friend Doris Day was launching a cable series about pets, and Rock had promised to appear at her press conference. On July 16, 1985, he showed up late in Carmel, California, and when he walked out, the room went quiet. The handsomest man of his Hollywood generation was gaunt, hollow-cheeked, moving slowly, his speech halting. Doris Day kept her composure and stood beside him, but the footage ran on national news for days. Veteran columnist Army Archard, who had been sitting on what he knew, wrote it plainly in Variety. Rock Hudson had AIDS. His publicists denied it. 2 days after the press conference, Rock flew to Paris in a last attempt to resume the treatment he'd abandoned. On July 21st, he collapsed in his suite at the Ritz. The initial cover story, issued by his American publicist, was inoperable liver cancer. It held for 4 days. There was one more indignity in those Paris days, and it involved his old friends in the White House. Rock's team pleaded for him to be transferred to a French military hospital where the treatment could be administered, a transfer that needed high-level intervention. His publicist reached out to the Reagans directly. They declined to help. The president called him in the hospital to wish him well. The call was kind. The help never came. On July 25, 1985, in a statement delivered by French publicist Yannou Collard, with Rock's consent, the truth was finally said out loud. Rock Hudson had AIDS. 30 years of machinery, the invented name, the killed magazine story, the arranged marriage, the banned photographs, the paid-off blackmailers, all of it ended in a single sentence read to reporters in Paris. The secret Henry Willson had spent a fortune protecting was gone in under a minute. What happened next surprised everyone, including the people who had spent years begging America to pay attention, because the country did something it had refused to do for 4 years of the epidemic. It looked. He was flown home to Los Angeles at the end of July, laid up in UCLA Medical Center for a month, and then released into hospice care in his own house in Beverly Hills. He had 10 weeks left. What happened during those 10 weeks changed the country. Rock Hudson had feared, correctly, that his announcement would be treated as scandal. What he did not expect was the flood of letters, tens of thousands of them, from fans, from strangers, from people who had watched him on their television sets for 30 years and were not, in the end, willing to look away from him now. Fellow actors publicly voiced their support. Elizabeth Taylor, who had been his friend since Giant, refused to keep quiet. In September of 1985, Taylor helped organize a benefit dinner in Los Angeles called Commitment to Life. It was the first major celebrity AIDS fundraiser, and it happened because Rock's diagnosis had made refusing to attend look, for the first time, like a moral choice. 2,500 people came. They raised $1.3 million. Rock was too sick to be there, but he sent a message to be read aloud. "I am not happy that I am sick," he wrote. "I am not happy that I have AIDS, but if that is helping others, I can at least know that my own misfortune has had some positive worth." Taylor read those words and then spent the rest of her life doing something about them. She co-founded the American Foundation for AIDS Research, AMFAR, later that same year. Rock left the organization $250,000 in his will, seed money that helped launch it. She would raise, over the following decades, hundreds of millions of dollars for research and testify before Congress about a disease that most of official Washington still refused to name in public. She has said openly that Rock's death gave her the purpose of her life. She was with him. She visited his bedside up until the day before he died. Ronald Reagan, Rock's old friend, had still not delivered a formal address on AIDS. He would not do so until May of 1987, by which point more than 20,000 Americans had died of the disease. But he mentioned it publicly for the first time at a press conference on September 17, 1985, 2 days before the Commitment to Life dinner. It was a small thing. It happened because Rock Hudson was dying. On October 2, 1985, Rock Hudson died at his home in Beverly Hills. He was 59. His body was cremated. His ashes were scattered at sea. The house on Warbler Place, the beach in Puerto Vallarta, the dressing rooms and the trailers and the sound stages, and the Ritz suite in Paris, all of it emptied out into 10 weeks of national conversation about a subject that had, until him, been almost impossible to hold in public view. The scandal did not end at his death. Mark Christian, who had been living with Rock through the diagnosis and had learned the truth from the news broadcasts along with everyone else, sued the estate for intentional infliction of emotional distress, claiming Rock had continued to sleep with him for months without telling him about the AIDS. A California jury sided with Christian and awarded a settlement in the millions. The case set a legal precedent about the duty to disclose. Christian, for what it's worth, said until his own death in 2009 that he had genuinely loved Rock. Phyllis Gates outlived Rock by 21 years. She died in 2006, at 80, of lung cancer. Until the end, she said she had loved him and had not known. Henry Willson had already died in 1978, 7 years before Rock, broke and largely forgotten in the motion picture retirement home. Only 2 former clients came to his funeral. Rock sent flowers. Look at the whole shape of it. A shy boy from Winnetka becomes a manufactured leading man. A crisis becomes a marriage. A marriage becomes a divorce with a hidden tape. A career becomes a 30-year performance. A body finally refuses to keep the secret. And in 10 weeks of dying, that body did more to force America to look at AIDS than 4 years of the epidemic had managed on their own. Rock Hudson never publicly said the word gay in his lifetime. He didn't have to. His dying said everything. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.